Hello everyone, this is the video that goes along with the lesson on attachment theory. This, this lesson is meant to be a complementary lesson to the chapter that you've read for this week. So as usual, you can feel free to get in touch with me if you have any need for clarification about what we're discussing this week, or if you have any questions about due dates or anything like that. So what we mean by attachment when we discuss attachment theory is the inborn or inherent system that each of us possess that allows us as infants to borrow the mature functions of our caregivers' minds. And so it's a little like being able to borrow the map of a territory from our caregivers so that we can explore that territory. And that's very useful because as infants we're fairly ill-equipped with being able to develop relationships. And the territory that the maps we're borrowing outline is the way that we make relationships. That's what we're exploring as infants. We're watching our caregivers develop relationships with us. We're watching them develop relationships with others around us. And that's how we learn to develop relationships that we, a habit which we take with us throughout most of our lives. And what that inborn or inherent system that we all have leads us to do is seek out proximity with others and seek out ways of communicating with others, because the nearness and communication are the ways that we learn from each other. So most of the information that I'm going to talk about today in large part comes from, in some form or another, the book The Developing Mind by Dan Siegel. He's a very well-known expert in attachment theory, and so well worth looking up if you want to know more. Any discussion about attachment theory should necessarily require some discussion of memory. And the reason for that is that our early experiences impact us by the way in which we kind of carry them with us. We learn from them. And the way that we carry experience with us, so to speak, is in our memory or remembrance of experience. So when we say the word memory, what we actually mean is something different than like opening a file drawer and picking out a file that you want to remember of a time that you see and hear in your mind. That's usually how it feels, like we're searching our mind for our memory and then, oh yeah, I've got it, I remember it now. That's how it feels. But what actually occurs in the brain is something like this. So let's take an example like saying the Pledge of Allegiance, for instance. The Pledge of Allegiance is something that all of you are, I'm sure, fairly familiar with, and you probably know it. And so the first time you ever heard that Pledge of Allegiance, your brain responded to hearing others state it or hearing yourself speak it, if you're reading it, by activating a sort of web of neurons, that's brain cells, and the pattern that activation took shape as is called a neural net profile. It's a little like a blueprint for the experience at the level of the brain, or like a fingerprint of the brain at the moment that you were experiencing listening or reading or saying the Pledge of Allegiance. So each time that occurs, there's a higher probability that it will occur again. That's why repetition is an important part of learning. So every time you said the Pledge of Allegiance, a similar neural net profile was activated in the brain, similar kind of brain fingerprint, and every time that happened, it made it more likely that it would happen again. So that's over time, that's how memory develops. A useful phrase to remember in relation to this is neurons that fire together, wire together. What that means is that as neurons sync up and fire together as as one of those neural net profiles. Those neurons all work kind of in a team. Every time that happens, it sort of subtly links all of those neurons together, making it more likely that they'll fire at the same time again in the future. Very quickly, a couple of somewhat strange words, but these words point to very kind of important parts of memory. Engram is the experience of the brain upon first, the state of the brain upon first experiencing something. So the first time you heard the Star Spangled the Pledge of Allegiance, or read it or said it, the brain took that sort of state of as the engram. It's kind of like the stamp that experience made on you the first time. And ekphory is the sensation or the feeling of recalling that as a memory. That feeling that you get when you remember something. It's different than the feeling of just having a new thought, right? So that feeling of remembering is what ekphory refers to. There are two types of memory. There's implicit memory and explicit memory. Implicit memory has three primary attributes. One is that the experiences are not tagged consciously as memory. So when you experience something that's an implicit memory, it does not feel like it. You don't have the ekphory experience. You don't feel like you're drawing it to mind. So in that way, it feels rather than it feeling like it happens in the past, that you're drawing forward as a memory. It actually feels like it's happening right now. So there's that attribute that it's not tagged as a memory. It's not like labeled as a memory, and also it doesn't have the sensation of being called forth as a memory. So that's the second attribute. And the third is that it actually, implicit memory actually filters our experience at the level of perception, at the level of thought and imagination, at the level of behavior, the level of emotion. So all of our experiences are kind of put through the filter of our implicit memories. Now, explicit memory is made up of two types. Explicit memory can be semantic or factual, which is just like I'm remembering the names and dates and places and times. And the other type of explicit memory is called episodic. Episodic is the memory of me experiencing the memory. So I can remember the dates and times, say, of something that may have happened to me as a young child, and I could probably describe the scene, what it was like, what the environment was like, who was there, what time of day it was, stuff like that. But there's a different quality of remembering that puts me at the center of the memory. Like, I can remember how it felt to be there at that time of the day with all of those people around me. And an important thing to remember about explicit memory is during what they call big T trauma, or capital T trauma. That's major trauma to a young person. Explicit memory is temporarily hindered. So cortisol is the hormone in the body that's nicknamed the stress hormone. When you feel very stressed, you have a lot of cortisol in your body, in your blood. And when enough cortisol is released, then the hippocampus, which is sort of in charge of storing long-term memory, is basically shut down. So for that period of time that you're experiencing that trauma, your brain is not equipped to encode and carry with you explicit memory. So that's why people who undergo severe trauma sometimes have kind of a blockage of their memory. Sometimes they have what are called dissociative disorders, where the consistency of their consciousness is disrupted. That's the result of that memory disruption. Okay, so a little bit more about attachment. It's worth thinking about attachment as a way that we carry with us those who are important to us in our early lives. We create what are called internal working models of others and of ourselves in relation to others, which is, again, kind of like a blueprint or a map of the terrain. And we carry that with us into life, even if the people who we experienced it with are long gone. And the earlier research on attachment that began with some set of experiments, one of which was called the strange situation study, basically amounted to, in the end, 4 different attachment categories, or they're kind of like styles of attachment that all of us have one or more of. And I say one or more of because sometimes we have kind of styles or shadings of one or another in different with different types of relationships. But in general, we could probably be thought of as having one characteristic style about our attachment. So secure is where we basically feel settled and stable in our independence, and also able to rely on others in relationship, independent relationships. Avoidant is a kind of under development of the ability to rely on others, and an overemphasis in turning toward oneself and relying only on oneself. These are very quick and general descriptions of these categories. There's a lot more to be said. But the ambivalent attachment category is kind of like the reverse of avoidant, an over reliance on others and an under reliance on self, so therefore kind of an underdevelopment of self. And the last, disorganized or disoriented, results from that big T trauma that I was talking about. Really distressing, significantly traumatic things sort of shake the integrity of who a person is long term. Now, at the root of all these is what's called the reflective function. The reflective function is the ability to perceive and understand the mind of oneself and the mind of others. Okay, so the reflective function has to do with noticing what's going on within me, and my thoughts, my emotions, my memory, and it also has to do with noticing what could possibly be going on in the world, in the inner world of others, how others might be thinking, how others might be feeling, and so on. And we learn that as a part of our upbringing. Secure attachment, for instance, is said to have a matured or intact reflective function, and the others, to varying degrees, have slightly less matured function of reflection, like that. Okay, so really quickly, a little bit about what I was mentioning, like how we relate to ourselves and how we possibly relate to others. It's useful to think of the process of attachment in terms of how we relate to others, and then build a habit of relationships, how we learn how to have relationships. When we talk about the self, that's something that we have a relationship to. I have a relationship to myself, and that relationship to myself is very strongly influenced by my early caregiving experiences as an infant and young person. So the less secure attachment styles tend to place a person in a position of slightly weakened sense of self. That means like the integrity of myself being secure on its own while being able to rely on others is a little bit weakened or underdeveloped. When we use the word self, it's useful to realize that there are different ways that we experience ourselves. There's a bodily way of experiencing myself. I'm noticing the subtle temperature changes in the room around me. I'm noticing my body's movements and position and posture and things like that. A perspectival sense of self relates to the fact that as I'm seeing the world from this perspective, I'm hearing the world from this perspective, and at the center of that perspective is where I am. Subjective sense of self has to do with the fact that it's a me, that I feel like I'm the one doing the thinking and feeling that I have, that relates to the thoughts and the feelings that I have. A narrative sense of self comes from not only how I think about myself, but how I imagine others think about me, how I imagine my wife thinks about me, or my family, or anyone else I might relate to. That the narrative self is the ongoing in time where I came from, what I came to be, based on my life leading up to this point. And the social sense of self is what I said earlier about how I think others think about me. And underlying that, there's could be argued that there's a kind of a core sense of self, the me noticing all of these things that occur. So I'm pointing these out because when you're relating to a child, there are different ways that we as professionals can help children develop a strong sense of self. And it has to do with all of these and possibly other ways of thinking about what a self is. We help a person develop a good sense of a bodily self, a good sense of a perspectival self, if you're the one that's perceiving what you're experiencing. A major part of attachment is the shared narrative. So this is you in your life story in comparison to others in our life story. So, all right, so attachment in relationships, what this means, what these kind of thoughts on attachment sort of point to, is that the caregivers are actually the architects of the way, I'm just reading this quote now, of the way in which experience influences the unfolding of a genetically pre-programmed but experience-dependent brain development, and that human connections actually create neural connections. So that places a heavy responsibility in the hands of caregivers, because they quite literally shape or give life, or give the contour of how a person, how an infant grows to know themselves and how they grow to know others. And so it's a pretty important job. That's at the bottom of what attachment theory really points to, is that early stage in life is really, that's what's happening during that early stage of life, and relationships are the way that that's happening. So there's the way that happens, the kind of mechanical way that happens, is that infants are born with too many brain cells, like way too many brain cells. So as they are born and then continue to grow, they have this overproduction of neurons. And the way that is balanced is that there's the environment, that means that how they grow up, what's around them and how people relate to them, actually prune away the neurons that are underused, that are not needed. It's important because if neurons of a part of the brain that are really required in social interaction, for instance, are not stimulated in early life, they literally die, just much like dead leaves fall off of a tree. And so our jobs as professionals and as caregivers early in life are to stimulate a child's attachment system within them, so that they begin to develop the habits of interaction that they can carry with them, as opposed to literally losing part of themselves, part of the parts of the brain that might naturally adapt to that function. So I want to say one more thing about how we bring this information into practice. As you interact with young people, and any people really, there will definitely be times where there is a kind of breakdown in communication, where the relationship is strained or under stress. And this is what we could call a rupture in secure attachment development. And this will happen. And what is important to remember is that there's no absolute smooth surface of secure attachment development. It's more like a series of subtle ruptures and then significant repairs to those ruptures. What a repair means is a coming back to the child or whoever it is you're interacting with, and authentically describe your own inner feelings, what you think their inner feelings and thoughts are, and grow through the rupture that you may both experience. Okay, so to sum up, I'm going to read this other quote here because I think it really points to something. Well, actually, you can read it. I'm going to pull out the couple of segments that I think are important. So this quote on this last slide points to, as it says, a direction for how relationships can foster healthy brain function and growth. That's a pretty good idea, cool idea, because to foster healthy brain growth and development, we might tend to think of medical type things. I don't know, diet or exercise or medicine or something. What attachment theory points to is the fact that relationships actually have quite a lot to do with healthy brain development. And some of the things that we can do as professionals, as adults, is develop sensitivity to the signals that children send to us, which are very typically nonverbal, but not always. We can develop a skill to become attuned to those nonverbal signals. We can do our best to verbally reflect the mental states of the child that we're working with. It's basically just a guess at what they might be thinking and feeling. And we'll talk more about this as we get into active listening in this class. And also, we can develop the ability to communicate in a contingent way. That means we decide what we say it, how we respond, how we act. We base that on what we're seeing and sensing from the other, from the child. That doesn't mean that we aren't, stern when we need to be, or push through with an idea, or stick to our guns, so to speak. It means that the way we deliver what we know is needed will be kind of a collaborative process with the child. So we'll talk more about those types of things as we get to communication skills in this course, but I wanted to give you a broad overview of some of the ideas about attachment and why, and possibly, hopefully, you see kind of some ways that it relates to communication and the skills that we'll be discussing further in the course. Okay, so that's that. There are a couple of assignments on Blackboard, and of course my line is open if you need to ask any questions.